Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 9th, 2009, and my guest is Arnold Kling, who blogs at EconLog on the EconLab website and is the author of two new books, Unchecked and Unbalanced, and From Poverty to Prosperity, Intangible Assets, Hidden Liabilities, and the Lasting Triumph Over Scarcity, co-authored with Nick Schultz. Arnold, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ.
Arnold, our topic for today is prosperity, and unfortunately we'll probably talk about some poverty as well. You call your approach to growth issues and the issues of economic development and the economy writ large, Economics 2.0. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, this is the economics that you don't hear about, first of all, in the mainstream media, and also, oddly enough, you don't typically hear much about it if you take an undergraduate macroeconomics curriculum and maybe even a graduate economics curriculum as well. The traditional economics is all about allocating a given amount of resources, and you'll even see in textbooks the idea that you're supposed to, people have unlimited wants, limited resources, and the economic problem is to allocate scarce resources among competing ends.
Guns versus butter.
Yeah,
this horrible textbook version of that.
Yeah, all the classic story. And what this is about, and again, it's, I'm going to say it's not in mainstream, so I'm going to make it sound like this is some, weird rogue view, but of the 10 economists that we interview in the book, 4 of them won Nobel Prizes, and the others are all highly prestigious. So this is a prestigious view, but it's just not widely disseminated for whatever reason. People like to talk about scarcity. It's really the kind of the flip side of scarcity is a story of abundance. First of all, just in terms of measuring the standard of living and how it's changed over time, and how in some sense it's changed very suddenly. You can argue that from the time when people first formed civilizations until around 1800, the standard of living changed relatively little compared to dramatic improvements in the standard of living since then. So, roughly speaking, if people lived on the equivalent of $150 a year up until around 1500 or 1600 or so, and then you get from 1800 to now, people go from, let's say, a couple $100 a year to $8,000 a year. This would be on a worldwide average. Of course, in the U.S., it's more like $40,000 a year. So you get this tremendous acceleration in growth in the standard of living. So just as a fact out there. And then the interesting thing is, where did that come from? Because the traditional economics says, well, you've got these scarce resources. The only place that could come from is people forgoing consumption today to get consumption tomorrow by accumulating capital. And yet, clearly, we've been able to go way beyond what we could get just by accumulating capital. And so that brings up the intangible factors that we talk about, and the main intangible factor being ideas, innovations.
Now, of course, some of that is produced by capital. Those ideas, I think what's fascinating about this issue of how much we teach and understand these topics is, I think the average undergraduate economics major has some idea that technology or innovation has something to do with our standard of living. But we don't teach our students much about the texture of that, which is a lot of what your book's about. And we don't teach them where it comes from. I think when we say the word, or when you use the word ideas, it tends to cause people to think, oh, well, just someone's thinking, and they think of an idea, and that gets added to the pile of ideas. But, of course, it's more than that. There's a massive focused effort at some ideas and not others, right? There's a massive research and development effort in the private sector and a non-trivial amount coming from the public sector as well. Yeah,
the one phrase that I think comes up a lot in sort of in Economics 2.0 is trial and error. So, think of the way pharmaceutical companies operate. They literally will just try a bunch of different molecules and see how those molecules will affect different symptoms in different tissues. And then if they find some that they think are promising, then they'll maybe try them on animals. And then if they work on animals and if they're safe on animals, then they'll go on to human trials. So there's this huge trial and error process involved in innovation. And we also believe that that's true with entrepreneurship in general. We all saw, 10 years ago, the dot-com experience where there was, all sorts of new companies formed to try all sorts of things. And there were some spectacular failures like Pets.com that was going to deliver pet food to your door. But there were a couple of spectacular successes like Amazon.
And at the time, they weren't in. You couldn't have predicted which one was going to make it. They were all losing money.
Right. If you'd tried to predict, if you'd been able to predict, you'd have been very rich because you would have stayed out of the ones that failed and only invested in the ones that succeeded. But ex ante, it was a trial and error process, and the ones that succeeded and the ones that even now are succeeding are producing spectacular wealth.
Yeah, trial and error is underrated. It's also difficult to model. It doesn't lend itself to formalization very well, which may be part of the reason this isn't as commonly taught as it would otherwise be.
Yeah, one of the people we interview in the book is Joel. I don't even know how to pronounce his last name.
Mokir.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever had him on the show.
No, I haven't, but I do. I think I know how to pronounce his name, but go ahead.
Good.
I think it's Mokir.
Mokir. And he talks about the fact that because this is stuff that cannot be predicted, you really cannot model it. You really cannot forecast the way economic growth will take place because these ideas get used in ways that were not anticipated. And so things happen that were not anticipated.
Contrast that view. We haven't talked about this in a while in the program. If you go back to the archives, we'll put some links up. In the early days of the program, I focused a lot of shows on this issue of growth and talked to a lot of people about how growth was once taught at graduate school. And you went to MIT. Robert Solow is really the premier growth theorist of the generation that when we were in graduate school. So talk about how, say, in the 60s and 70s, even a little before, how economists thought about growth and how that's changed.
Well, it's even true now. My daughter's in college and has, had to grind through these Solow model calculations, and it's a story of capital. It's a story of capital accumulation, and as for an economy as a whole, you defer some consumption today in order to accumulate capital, and that's how you grow. And there are a number of things wrong with that model, and Solow himself found the most important problem, which was empirically, capital accumulation doesn't account for very much of the increase in standard of living over time. Maybe on the order of a quarter, maybe less.
Or the differences across countries as well, right?
But the differences across countries are not accounted for terribly well by capital differences. In fact, one of the things that got us sort of going to write this book was a report that came out under the auspices of the World Bank, which did a growth accounting analysis of the standard of living in different countries, and they converted it into wealth terms. So they said, instead of just saying what's the income of the U.S. versus some other country, they said what's the wealth. And in that measure, the average citizen in a very well-developed country has over $400,000 of wealth. That is sort of lifetime income, you might think of that. And most of that wealth is intangible. It is not accounted for.
It's not gold coins, and
it's not accounted for by the resources of the country. It's not accounted for by the capital of the country. It's all intangible. It's things like human capital, your education, but it also, you have this odd phenomenon that they show for some countries negative intangible wealth. And how can you have negative intangible wealth? And the answer there is that their institutions are so harmful. Think of countries like North Korea, that the institutions cause so much harm that they produce less than what you'd think they'd be able to produce just based on their labor and capital. That the institutions actually subtract output and wealth from the country.
Let's step back one step further and talk about capital, which is a phrase that economists bandy about very loosely. The standard view of a country's resources would be labor, that's people, raw materials, iron, iron ore, gold, other assets of that physical kind. And capital, by capital, we mean what? Traditionally in economics.
Traditionally, capital is produced goods that can be used to produce other goods. So I think of things like factories, machine tools, office buildings, computers. There's equipment and plant that is used to produce other goods.
And in the Economics 2.0 approach, knowledge, which could be embodied in human beings and is embodied as well in physical machinery, but also has an independent existence. Knowledge is really driving an enormous amount of our productivity, where knowledge includes know-how. It's not facts, right?
Yeah, it's everything that people.
Isn't those other things?
That is, yeah. It's a huge. If you start to think about it, knowledge is just, from knowing, how to prevent dysentery. That's an example Paul Romer uses. If you put
used it on this program we interviewed as well. Yeah.
So you can link to that. But put a little sugar in water, and you can prevent dysentery. Walmart, knowing how to operate its logistics system, is worth a tremendous amount. It's increased our GDP and our wealth a lot, and that's know-how. Companies are constantly trying to learn and improve and come up with better ways of doing things. So knowledge can be everything from scientific knowledge, really abstract knowledge, to just workers learning, figuring out how to do their jobs a little better on an assembly line or in a store.
It's kind of strange that it's taken economics a few hundred years to start thinking about these intangible assets. Now, part of it, of course, is that they weren't as important 200 years ago as a lot of physical capital, but I think it's I think some folks listening out there who aren't trained economists would go, well, duh, sure, figuring out stuff is really important. And most of us are in jobs, in this job that I'm in right now where we're doing this podcast, there is some physical capital, there's some microphones, and there's a recording device, and there's a flash card, and there's a server that delivers the podcast to folks, and that's all physical capital. It's obvious that the intangible part of this podcast, which includes trivial but important things in a way, such as how to upload the file into the server, right? That's not unimportant, but that's a little piece of know-how I've mastered, right? A little trivial piece of know-how, but still important. Trivial in the sense it's not hard to do. But most of what we're producing right here, you and I, in this conversation, is in our brains, can't be measured, only can be measured really in meaningless ways, like how many hours did I spend preparing for this podcast, you wouldn't call that an input into the production function of this experience.
Yeah, it's and once you start thinking in those terms, you really think about the economy differently. And that's the point that Nick and I try to make about this book, is that people really will think about the economy and economics differently once they concentrate and focus on this. I mean, one example of this, that there's this one-liner from George Mason economist Garrett Jones, that most people today, most workers don't make widgets, they build organizational capital. Most people who work in companies are really trying to add to the capacity of that company to do something new, or to control the risks of the company, or to do something that's generic. They're not actually assembling things by hand or making new output. And that creates a very different environment for something like macroeconomics, which assumes that everybody's this homogeneous, unskilled labor.
And all capital is K.
Yeah.
It's homogeneous capital. Now, one of the things that it encourages you to think about differently is the traditional sources of economic prosperity that I think a lot of people are still very attached to, manufacturing being the most dramatic one. So in the political debate, you often hear, if you spend too much time on Capitol Hill, you'll often hear, well, we can't get rich doing each other's laundry. And so the idea would be, we used to make stuff. Now we have a service economy, and services are really going to ultimately impoverish us, because doing laundry doesn't make you rich. There's nothing tangible about it. It's just cleaning stuff in this case. And what's the answer of Economics 2.0 to that worry?
The answer for a consumer end is, of course, you're going to get better and better goods and services at lower and lower cost through innovation. So, in the case of laundry, the Economics 1.0 story is, isn't it great that you can send your shirt out to be ironed by somebody else, so you can use your comparative advantage to work on something else? And the Economics 2.0 answer is, well, that's great that you can send your shirt out to be ironed by somebody else, but haven't you heard of permanent press? Somebody came up with an idea that allows you to eliminate the job of ironing shirts altogether. And that kind of innovation is what creates abundance, certainly from a consumer point of view. And then what you'll get from people worried about that is, well, gosh, what kind of work are people going to do if you put the people who press shirts out of business by doing permanent press? And the answer has to be that people are going to learn to do these sort of building organizational capital type jobs, where they are coming up with new ideas or helping new products reach the market and things like that. They're going to be using their brains a lot more.
I think there's a risk of implying that we're all going to end up being consultants for, consulting firms. And the permanent press story, and then, of course, the new version of permanent press is the no iron, 100% cotton shirt, because permanent press was synthetic. That was the way they solved the having to have somebody iron your clothes. And now you can have 100% cotton that breathes and have no iron, which I think is a wonderful innovation personally. But I think I want to hone in on a little piece of this, because the traditional worry about innovation is that people get replaced by machines. And what you're really saying is that people get replaced by ideas. And one way to see it in our daily life, it's happening right now, is it used to be that if you were on a trip up the East Coast, you're going to New York or Boston from the D.C. area or vice versa, you're going to pay tolls to these booths that are put along the highway, and there's people standing in those booths. It doesn't seem like to be a very interesting job, but they're people who are paid and made a living collecting quarters, or in some cases a few dollars. They've now been replaced, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are replaced by a little device you put on your dashboard or in your window that, Easy Pay, that Easy Pass, is one of them, that measures this electronically, so you don't have a person. So that person gets put out of work. But it would really be misleading to say that that there aren't as many, and of course I don't always put out of work, it's just that those jobs are not the opportunities that people coming in the job market have. But it'd be misleading to say that the Easy Pass transmitter put the person out of work. It's really the extraordinary set of software behind that little gadget that is doing the work. And I think that's really what's important about this transition you're talking about. Do you agree? Yeah,
that it's somebody had to come up with the concept of, we could get people through toll booths faster if they had an electronic transponder, and the technology is here now to use that kind of transponder. And wouldn't it be great if we had the same transponder usable in Maryland as New York? So all those ideas had to be put together and then implemented.
And that gets us really to the next a piece of this that we haven't talked about yet. That's in Paul Romer's work a lot, and that you write about in the book, which is the non-rivalrous aspect. So we're producing this good called EconTalk. One more listener. Eventually enough listeners will put pressure on our bandwidth, but in general, it's not rivalrous. As many people can enjoy EconTalk as want to, and please go out and tell your friends so that we can increase that. But the same is true with the transponder. You need the additional device. The physical device is an economics 1.0 device in a sense. Everybody's got to have one in their car, so you have to get another one. But the network of people that are communicating and paying is scalable in a rather extraordinary way and very efficiently.
Yeah, well, we talk about, if you think about the nature of hardware versus software, if I have a computer, it's hard for you to use my computer. You certainly can't use the same keyboard at the same time I'm using it. But if I have software and you have another copy of the software, there's no reason why you and I both can't be running spreadsheets at the same time. And so a lot of what we're talking about as Economics 2.0 is stuff that operates like software. That is, it isn't, as you said, it's not rivalrous. Many people can use it at once. It can be replicated cheaply and so on. So if I come up with a better idea for running a fast food restaurant, you can copy that idea. You can see, wow, he arranged the people this way and divided the work this way, and I can do the same thing. Or he created this kind of contracts, and I can do the same thing. One of the big challenges that people have is when somebody comes up with what's called a business process patent. Like Amazon at one point wanted to patent the idea of being able to order with one click. Why should they be able to do that and no one else be able to do that just because they thought of it? That it creates tension.
Of course, you want them to have an incentive to think of it, so that's the tension also, right?
Yeah, and there's a fair discussion in the book of this issue of intellectual property, because if you get to the point where intangible stuff matters more and ideas matter more, you're going to be confronted increasingly with value that is not embedded just in hardware or in physical stuff, but value that's in ideas. And that immediately raises issues of, well, how should intellectual property be handled and so on. And I don't think we have a conclusive one-size-fits-all answer for that. I mean, there are people who might make that claim, but my view is that there are some situations where clearly a lot of work goes into developing the idea, and yet the idea could easily be copied. So, again, the case of a pharmaceutical where you go through years of trial and error and you come up with this molecule that works and you are ready to market the molecule, and then somebody else could come along and just say, oh, okay, well, I don't have to do all the work, but I can copy that molecule and I can sell it for a lot cheaper. So you think that intellectual property problem is somewhat difficult. Whereas something like Amazon's one-click ordering, I don't think it took them years and years of trial and error and painful research to come up with it. That's probably something you could come up with in a couple of days or an afternoon or maybe in a 5-minute brainstorming. And you wouldn't want to give that years of legal protection, at least in my view.
the hardware-software distinction, talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned the non-rivalrous part, but I found that to be a very useful way to think about issues of growth and issues of poverty, particularly when you talk about bugs in the software. So talk about that metaphor a little bit more.
Okay, so there are two main stories that we're trying to deal with. One is, why is the standard of living so much higher than it was 200 years ago? And the software part of that story is ideas, and we've been discussing that. And the other question, but the question that raises, since if ideas are easily copied, easily replicated, that's our story, and that's how growth just takes off, because ideas just start building on each other, and ideas are easily copied, and so you can get lots of growth without investing necessarily lots of resources, we don't use up resources when you're using ideas. But then that makes the other issue of the differences in the standard of living across countries even more puzzling. Why is it that North Korea doesn't use the same ideas that we use? Why is it that Mugabe's country doesn't use the same ideas that we use? And then the answer is another aspect of software, which we could think of as analogous to the operating system. Communism being a different operating system than capitalism, or Mugabe's dictatorship being a different operating system than a more democratic society. And there clearly are problems with certain operating systems, that they really mess up the ability of the economy to operate. So we describe those operating systems as being extremely buggy compared to the operating systems that work better, like those in Hong Kong or Singapore or the United States.
And what are some of the bugs?
So the bugs would include things that I'm sure we've talked about on other podcasts, things like poorly enforced property rights, the government confiscating wealth, so there's very little incentive to create it, and the government just dictating all aspects of the economy, something like North Korea.
You mentioned poorly enforced property rights. Property rights in the United States have changed, physical property rights and probably intellectual property rights. They've changed quite a bit in the last 50 years. There's a lot more, I would argue there's a lot more uncertainty about the economic environment. Certainly in today's world, we see a lot of that uncertainty with how regulations are going to go. But just thinking about many, many countries in the developed world do lots of redistribution, do lots of high taxes. They seem to thrive. Why is it that, say, in Scandinavia, even though government, or much of Europe, there's lots of government and it's big, they seem to use ideas? I don't know how many they produce relative to the United States. That's an interesting argument. But certainly, if you think about the transition over time in the developed world, not the undeveloped, the developing world, but among rich nations, you could argue that a rule of law is diminished. There's more confiscation. There's less certainty about what you get to keep. How come we're doing so well?
Well, I think several economists in our book, point out that we don't know what the optimal institutional structure is. We do a lot of things in this country. If you think about it, we, for a long time, have heavily regulated or had heavy government involvement in many sectors. You can talk about housing, agriculture, education, health. And imagine you were a startup country, somehow, starting up from scratch, and you're looking at the United States as your shining example. Well, which of those regulations should they copy? Should they have our same agricultural policy? Should they have our same housing policy? Should they have our same financial regulation policy? So which of these policies should they copy? The fact is,
you could argue all of them, because look how well we're doing.
And you could argue none of them,
right.
Because as an economist, I can offer some pretty powerful critiques of all of them. So it's a very difficult thing to settle. What are the optimal institutions? I think all we can conclude is that we know that sort of communist dictatorship and allocation of resources doesn't work, and that there are so many examples. And one of the exhibits we list in our book, which we borrow from Brad DeLong, compares things like Cuba versus Mexico, North Korea versus South Korea. You could also have gone back and compared East Germany to West Germany. So I think we know that communism doesn't work
for the average person.
Right, but in terms of all these other institutional issues, I think there's plenty of room for controversy. I think there are lots of economists who would say that government-provided universal education is a great thing. It's a necessary thing for development. And there are those of us who say, well, at this point, this government-provided universal education may be holding the United States back.
And, of course, how you feel about those different issues might vary over time. You might feel one way about them when the economy is relatively developed versus when it's relatively undeveloped. But I think it raises an interesting casual bit of economic history that I find it fascinating that we don't have a very decisive answer to. I think if you talk to folks about the evolution of the U.S. standard of living between, say, 1880 and the present, let's take the century 1880 to 1980. When America goes through industrialization, starts leaving the agricultural sector behind due to innovation and productivity, there's a lot of improvement in standard of living, interrupted by the Great Depression, and then restarted afterward with pretty big success. There's a bunch of people out there who say, well, if it weren't for all those regulations, that would never have happened. And other people argue, if it weren't for those regulations, the growth would have been even greater. We don't have any way to evaluate those two claims, I don't think, other than prior knowledge and bias.
I think those are very difficult issues because we don't run too many controlled experiments. That's why people jump on, let's say, East Germany versus West Germany. It looks like a natural experiment, or North Korea versus South Korea looks like a natural experiment. And you just have to, I think it's unfortunate you're just going to have to use intuition. And maybe one of the issues that this can bring up is the idea of having more trial and error in terms of government. That's a separate book, but at least one person who's read this book immediately reacted by thinking, wow, that since trial and error seems to be the way that we learn and grow for economic, in the economy, that's how businesses get better. Why wouldn't that be a better way for government to operate? But again, that's another book.
Yeah, mostly the worry would be trial and mostly error, I guess, would be the concern. Whether you can weed it out. We weed it out in the marketplace. The Edsel doesn't last for very long. I use in my book the example of Corfam, this miracle shoe fabric that was going to change the world. And just like the ironing example, you were going to have to polish your shoes anymore. Turns out it didn't breathe very well, looked kind of fake, and people didn't like it, so it dropped out of the marketplace. The ability of government to deal with that's it's a little trickier.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, a main theme in all of my writing is that markets are very efficient trial and error vehicles because as you say, there's a profit and loss system, and when companies lose money, the innovations that they tried fall by the wayside, and the ones that make money survive. And in government, we don't have that equivalent thing. I don't know if you saw this just about a week ago. Atul Gawande, who writes for The New Yorker.
Yeah, I was thinking about bringing it up, but I before you bring it up, just remember that we don't take any position on pending legislation here on the EconTalk program.
Well,
go ahead.
But what Gawande said is that the key to a better healthcare system is more trial and error on the part of government.
Yeah.
And I just cringed when I saw that because I think government is the most ineffective trial and error mechanism out there. And the market is such an effective trial and error mechanism. It just my jaw dropped when I read that.
Yeah, mine did too. Yeah, he's an interesting guy, but that was I thought an unusual claim. Before we go on to some related issues, I want to ask you about something that came up in passing, and I think it mystifies a lot of folks, which is the role of savings. In the old days, the Economics 1.0 story was to grow, you need to put aside money today. You have to save. Without savings, you can't have growth. And I want to argue, I think that's still true. The nature of what the money gets devoted to isn't what we used to talk about solely. We used to talk about you don't consume the apple, you save it so that the seeds. It's a stupid example, never mind. But you don't consume you don't use up everything that's around today. You set some of it aside so it'll grow larger tomorrow. Tree would be a better example. You don't chop down the tree and make a table. You let it grow over time, and then you get a house. So that kind of economic productivity was one view of the relationship between savings and growth. And I think when we talk about these intangible ideas, there's a tendency to say, well, we don't have to just make houses. We can make ideas, and ideas don't use up current consumption as much. But as I suggested a little at the beginning, I want to get I didn't really hear your answer to this. You still have to make sacrifices today to get stuff tomorrow. It's just not the same. Or do you disagree with that?
No, I agree. There are two types of saving that are important. One is in terms of developing your own human capital, because a big component of this intangible is people's own knowledge. And an interesting question now is whether the people who are setting aside money to pay for college are going to get a good return out of it. And that's an interesting issue. So there's human capital, and the other is that a lot of these ideas do require research efforts. If nothing else, they require the trial and error. So we're going to, to start a business, even in today's environment, still costs some money to start a business. And then some of these businesses are going to fail, and those failures are in some sense part of the saving or part of the sacrifice that you make in order to get progress.
So going back to your opening comment, there is still scarcity at a point in time. It's just that the dynamic story is equally or more important, right? At a point in time, there is a trade-off.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. The scarcity has not been eliminated. It's just that we definitely have been able to grow and grow more than what you would think would be possible if the only way you could increase output would be by setting aside output today to get output tomorrow. The ideas have expanded our wealth and our standard of living.
Now, you talk to a lot of folks in the book, really interesting people, and their insights are fascinating on growth and poverty. What do you think we've learned as economists over the last 50 years? And what do you think we still need to learn?
I think what we have learned is the importance of these intangibles. Again, the importance of ideas, of what we call recipes, knowing how to do things. And the fact that once you've learned how to do something, that knowledge doesn't depreciate the way capital depreciates. So there are all sorts of reasons why you get sort of positive returns, increasing returns, abundance, and so on. I think we've learned at a rough level to believe that institutional differences help explain differences in standard of living across countries. What we haven't learned is in a detailed level which institutions can work. And there's I think, a latent controversy. In fact, some people who've read the book have brought that controversy to the surface over whether the same institutions will work in different cultures. So if you look at North Korea versus South Korea, you can say, well, it's institutional differences. That they came from the same culture, and yet South Korea has a standard of living that's 15 to 20 times higher than North Korea. So clearly, it's institutional differences. But if you said to me, well, do you think that the project of going to Iraq and installing our idea of the right institutions is going to work there, I would say no. I think that there are too many cultural problems in order to do that. So there's a question. So at a very basic level, I don't think we know necessarily the relative role of culture in institutions, or how long a new institutional environment has to be in place in order to change culture. And then we don't know at a detailed level which institutions. Again, the examples of all the different regulatory policies in agriculture, finance, and education, and so on that we have in the U.S., which of those are optimal, which are suboptimal, which are better than what exists in other countries, which are worse. So there's a lot we don't know about institutional economics.
So where does that leave us for helping, or for countries that want to help themselves to get out of poverty? To me, it suggests obviously a very cautious, tempered approach, less hubris, more humility. But that's an argument for doing nothing. And doing nothing might be the best thing. I'm pretty confident, actually, in terms of foreign aid, that doing nothing is much better than sending thugs money or allowing them to confiscate money. So I have no problem with that as a first approximation, that doing nothing is better than sending people money. But if we want to do a little better than that, do we have any guidelines? I mean, it's a certain unsatisfying aspect to this, and it's not clear what empirical evidence would help us do better down the road.
Well, one of the people that we interview is Bill Easterly. I don't know if you've had him on.
We have.
Yeah, and he's probably the person I would be my go-to person on that issue. And he's very much in the trial and error camp. He has this distinction between searchers and planners.
Right.
So planners are people who try to, from a top-down, design systems that are supposedly going to increase development. And searchers are people who start out with what's on the ground and look for small improvements. And I think, I'm a strong believer in the searcher approach. Again, the main theme of this book is trial and error, and the superiority of this kind of searching versus planning. And Easterly supports a sort of entrepreneurialism in foreign aid, and entrepreneurialism wound up being a major theme in the book. That the person who tries an idea and then is going to either be successful or fail with that idea. That one person may not make a huge difference, but the cumulative effect of a lot of entrepreneurs trying things is that a few of them will be spectacularly successful, some of them will be very successful, and then the ones that fail will just disappear and not cause great harm. Whereas if you try something with a top-down plan and it fails, it will be a spectacular nationwide failure, and we've seen many, many of those.
Yeah, Hayek said the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And I guess the optimistic or positive story here is that I think there's a temptation to say, well, they have to figure it out themselves. They have to help themselves. And I think what poor nations, and I think what people have in the back of their minds, they have to work harder or get a better economic system. But I think what you're saying and what Easterly's saying is that institutional design, the software part of the story, has to evolve there in a way that's congruent with their culture and their existing institutions, can't be imposed from the outside. If they have the freedom to try those things and fail and try again and succeed in other ways and other experiments, their institutions will evolve to what's best for them. It's a very Hayekian story. It takes a while, though. I guess there's a certain impatience.
And not only is there impatience, but there's a sense that you didn't accomplish it. I mean, there's a cynical view of development that development assistance is designed to make the donors feel good, yeah. And the donors don't feel as good with trial and error processes as they do with big programs that have big names attached to them.
Yeah, that's true. Comment, if you if you'd like, on microfinance, which was a recipe I think a lot of people touted and still tout as a software improvement. Capital markets don't work very well in poor countries because of imperfect property rights and collateral. Hernando de Soto's spent an immense amount of time on this. And microfinance has been seen as a way to improve, that is, small loans, nothing grand, on a person-by-person basis as a way to jumpstart a poor country. Recent empirical work suggests it maybe isn't as productive as we thought. Have any thoughts on that?
I guess I haven't delved into that literature, so I wouldn't want to make a strong claim one way or the other.
What about China and India? They seem to have gotten something right. Do we know what it is? And it doesn't seem to be exactly what, again, we might have thought were the institutional changes that would be needed. There's still a lot of top-down stuff allegedly going on in China. India maybe less so. But why are they doing so well? And how does that fit in with the story of the book? Well,
India gets mentioned as kind of a negative example by William Lewis, who's one of the people we interview, because he points out things like the fact that maybe 90% of India's land doesn't have proper title, so there's huge inflation in the value of the land where you can get proper title. He points out that a lot of electricity gets stolen, which of course creates really bad incentives in the electricity market. And there's still somewhat of what the Indians refer to as the license raj, that it's hard to start a business, operate a business, and get through all the regulations. So India still has a lot of bugs in their operating system. Just fixing a few of them has enabled them to make progress. But the question is, will they continue to fix them and continue to remove those bugs? China is a case where you'll see economists arguing kind of both sides of that. There are some economists who just look at that, the sheer amount of power that is invested in the leaders of the Communist Party, and say that cannot be congruent with a decentralized type of system. But others look at it and say, well, actually, no, they really are allowing a bottom-up reform. There's a claim, I just read this in the Hoover Policy Review, that the difference between China and Russia in the past 20 years is that Russia tried to impose economic reform from the top down, and that China's reforms really were the government adapting to what first of all, what peasants were doing. Peasants were trying to do privatized farming, and the government finally just said, okay, we'll allow that. And that creates some productivity increase in agriculture that frees people that can then move to the industrial sector. And the industrial sector was one where because of these economic zones, the government was allowing something closer to free market capitalism. So the argument in this Hoover Policy Review article is that China has a bottom-up reform that the government is sort of tolerating and encouraging, and that is working better. That because it's reflecting the people's desires
and trial and error, presumably.
And trial and error. Whereas in Russia, people really were not ready for a capitalist system, and so what emerged was sort of a combination of a mafia-type system, which doesn't really protect property rights, and just a people's general resistance to the loss of their social safety net that they had under socialism.
Do we have any idea how much capitalism there really is in China? I mean, do they use prices? How free are people to compete? Do you have any measures of that? Is anybody looking at that? There must be, but hard to get data on it. Obviously, it's not an open society.
And the one thing I've heard is that they're not really free to accumulate capital. That the capital gets accumulated at a government level and then gets allocated. And you wonder how that can possibly work effectively. It goes against what we think of as capital markets needing to allocate capital to its best uses. The notion that that government would centrally allocate it and that you could continue to grow. So that'll just be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, supposedly they have a very high savings rate. I'm not sure what that means in the context of that. Is it confiscated? I don't really understand it.
No, I think there is a high personal savings rate in part because people, you have the one-child policy, so that what used to be the safety net for people growing old was having a lot of children. They kind of eliminated that, and there's no government social security system. So what you have in China is strong incentive for people to save for their old age, because there's nothing else that they can do. There's no other way they can protect themselves.
Arnold, people are myopic. They don't look ahead to the future. Don't you know that? That's why we have to have a social security system.
Tell that to the Chinese.
Okay. Let's close by talking about trade. I think if you'd asked economists at various times in the 20th century what creates prosperity, a lot of them would point to David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. There isn't a lot of trade in your book. What role is left in Economics 2.0 for the traditional topics of trade, comparative advantage, and specialization?
Well, I guess I would just call that Economics 1.0. Trade is a way of getting sort of almost a free lunch or something for nothing, or more out of resources, and that hasn't gone away as a way of getting more resources. But the Economics 2.0 focus is on technology. And it's sort of funny, we sometimes to try to explain trade and the advantage of it, we try to use a technology analogy. So, David Friedman talks about how we can grow cars in the wheat fields by growing wheat, shipping wheat overseas, and having the ships come back filled with cars. And that is actually a more efficient way to produce cars than to manufacture them. So that's sort of treating trade as if it's technology, but the Economics 2.0 is in some sense talking about how technology plays the role that trade traditionally played in economics, of allowing people to consume more with the resources they have.
But isn't there an additional aspect of this that I think we also leave out of our standard principles of economics stories, textbook stories? When we talk about trade, we talk about England swapping wool for wine with Portugal. And what happens in the modern world is multinational corporation builds a factory in Indonesia and brings all those recipes, all those ideas at no investment cost to the people of Indonesia, takes advantage of their low labor costs, but in doing so helps increase their standard of living.
Yeah, no, a big advantage of free trade in sort of the Economics 2.0 world is exactly that. It spreads ideas around. So, when Walmart comes up with a better logistics system, that puts pressure on every retailer to come up with a better logistics system. So trade has the advantage of putting competitive pressure on people to adopt the latest ideas. The issue of how a new idea gets adopted is a big one, and we say in our book that the entrepreneur's role is to force this adoption, because people resist change. I think big companies resist change. My experience in big companies is you get a lot of internal resistance to change, and one of the advantages of wide open free entry and markets that allow small firms to grow is that they put the kind of pressure on large organizations to change that's needed in order to produce change.
We're almost out of time. We are at the end of the Great Moderation. That has ended. During the Great Moderation, when the business cycle was thought to be tamed, a lot of economists started focusing on growth, and your book is really in many ways a compendium of what we've learned so far from some of the great minds that have focused on that, as well as the insights of the great minds of the authors of the book. But now we're in suddenly a very different world. And there's a certain, and I think about it, even though everyone knows I don't like physics as a metaphor for economics, this idea of whether light is a wave or a particle. There's a certain schizophrenia in economics for me between the business cycle versus growth. So all of a sudden, we're focused on the business cycle where we are today in 2009. People are thinking about growth per se. They're not worried so much about poor countries. They're worried about themselves. And you can get the paradox of thrift argument that says savings is bad. And I just find it seems we can't seem to think about them both at the same time. What are your thoughts on that and what the future might hold for where economics is going to focus its energies?
Yeah, I do think that looking at business cycles is, in some sense, taking your eye off the ball because growth matters. And Robert Lucas said that famous thing that once you start thinking about these large differences in standard of living over time, it's hard to think of anything else. And if you measure the changes in consumption during a recession, they really turn out to be pretty small. But people get frightened, or maybe government sees the crisis as an opportunity to expand, and so you do get this focus. But I think the perspective of the book would be, first of all, yes, this too shall pass. Secondly, that we probably will get a lot of things are going on, probably are increasing growth. That is, we're probably getting an acceleration in movement out of declining industries. And also people are going to have to be a lot more creative about how they start businesses and how they deal with human capital. I think the typical college student right now has to be thinking a lot more about what is going to be useful for a career than a few years ago when they just sort of took it for granted that they would come out and have some kind of nice job. So I think there's going to be a lot more creativity and a lot more thought into how businesses operate, into which businesses expand, and into how people develop their own careers. And the net effect of that, I think, is actually going to be positive for growth longer term.
My guest today has been Arnold Kling. Arnold, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.